What is up, fight fans? I am Jason Burgos for Sherdog.com, and I have the great pleasure of being joined by one of the very best grapplers on our planet. And the man has become the Babe Ruth of Submission Underground. He's a multiple-time grappling champion, a competitor so good that Chael Sonnen had to put together an 8-man, 1-9 tournament just to find someone that was a worthy foe for him. And that man is Australia's own Craig Jones. Mr. Jones, sir, thank you so much for the time today.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
Now, I'm sure I'm not the only person in the last few years that keeps hearing your name and becomes intrigued about you. And, people that maybe aren't familiar with the grappling scene and ADCC and all those things, and they would start watching Submission Underground, and they start looking at your highlights, in your competitions and stuff like that to see the growing legend. So, to help people understand your origin story, so to speak, what is your life journey that took you into grappling? Is it true that, a planned career in MMA helped you discovering the grappling arts and stuff like that? And also, what was the realization moment that it was like, shit, I'm really, really good at this, especially when it comes to being on the ground and the leg locks and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I started, I honestly can't even remember when I started, but my cousin, who was a white belt, I think he was a 4-stripe white belt, gave me a UFC DVD. And I think the DVD was BJ Penn versus GSP, the first match.
Oh, okay.
So I think it was around the UFC 50s or whatever. So I watched that, and he started teaching jiu-jitsu at the same time because my home city didn't really have much of a jiu-jitsu base. So I saw that. I was sort of hooked from the first time I watched it, and then I just started training with him. So my first coach was, I guess, a white belt at the time. And then I basically, I started training with him. MMA was illegal in Australia at the time, so we would sort of mess around with some MMA techniques and stuff. But I fell in love with jiu-jitsu because there were jiu-jitsu tournaments, so I could actually compete in jiu-jitsu. And then by the time MMA got legalized, I think in late 2009, my heart was already set on jiu-jitsu at that point. Had jiu-jitsu not been as profitable as career as it is these days, I probably would have made the MMA jump eventually. But luckily, we don't have to get hit in the head anymore unless we choose to. But then, I stayed with that coach up until purple belt. With him, it was tricky in the small city because I'd have to wait for him to get a promotion so he could promote me. Because obviously, you can't get promoted to blue belt from a white belt. But so we had a bit of a slow start. And then I moved to train more professionally at the end of 2015 to train with Lachlan Giles, who's probably Australia's best coach. Very famous for his last ADCC performance, where he's like a small guy, but he was able to get a bronze medal in the absolute. And then mainly to train with Gordon and train with this elite crew in America. And also just really the money to be made is in America in competitions and stuff. And flying Melbourne to LA, 16 hours. I'd done that so many times. That was really, really wear and thin. So this year I made the full-time move. I prepared with these guys. I basically been coming here on and off for about 2 years. I did about a 6-month stint here before the last ADCC. But I finally made the move. Made the move at the right time too, because now international borders are closed.
As you become the face of Submission Underground, they promote you as the man, and your headlining events, tournaments are being made just to find worthy adversaries. Is there new weights of expectation and pressure that you never had before? Unrealistic standards as they may be, you're marketed as a straight up assassin. And when you beat someone like Gilbert Burns in seconds and turn Vinny Magalhães' foot the other way, it's sort of lives up to the legend. But are there new pressures to maintain this high standard you kind of have set for yourself in Submission Underground?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of pressure. The biggest pressure was, so I've had 2 matches since they announced the tournament. So I don't know, Submission Underground were basically looking past my last 2 opponents because they had a tournament to face me. So it was sort of I remember thinking they told me they were going to do a tournament. And they said, "Oh, don't worry. Even if you lose your matches, you're gonna face up against the tournament winner." And I'm like, that sort of kills the tournament if one of these guys beats me. But I mean, I'm privileged now because I'm still training throughout quarantine. I'm privileged that I can compete. I think at one point I was the only sporting event in the world that weekend with Chael's son. And luckily, Chael's brave. We did it in a secret location and stuff. But the pressure's there. But I also feel just privileged to be able to still do my thing during this difficult time.
Before we get to what's to come on July 12th with Submission Underground 16 with Mason Fowler, I wanted to quickly talk about the Gabriel Checco match. He did a very good job in being one of the rare guys in SUG to be competitive and make it to overtime against you. And his defense of your leg locks by holding on to his own foot to keep it away from you was interesting. What did you think of his performance overall? And have you already started working on ways to combat those defenses that he employed? Because I'm sure everybody's going to try to copy it and try to survive the next time.
Yeah, so I mean, the difficult thing now, right, and this doesn't really take anything, I mean, it's more the mindset of my opponent, right? So Gabriel Checco survived the 5 minutes, and he was very, very happy to have just survived the 5 minutes. So, like, in terms of, usually jiu-jitsu is like, my opponent is trying to beat me, I'm trying to beat my opponent, and usually in that mix, we get a submission finish.
Yeah.
But my last two opponents really didn't try one offensive thing throughout the entire matches. So what, being that it's only 5 minutes, it's going to be very difficult for someone to tire out in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we go to overtime. So what my challenge now is, opponents may just want to survive the 5 minutes because they get some good press from it, or they may want to survive 5 minutes to try and face off against me in overtime and start in an advantageous position.
Yeah.
So really the challenge for me is to try and find a way to finish them in the 5 minute period when they are purely playing defense.
And it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up too, because now going to Mason a little bit, he seemed in like his second and especially in the finals, it seemed like he was, and I'm just guessing as a novice, playing the strategy game of getting to overtime and playing into those advantage a little bit. Especially against Roberto, who was fantastic. Do you expect the same thing against you, considering how big of a fight it is, how much attention on? Are you expecting not maybe him, just like you said, everybody? Are they just going to try to survive to get to the overtime against you now?
I feel like Mason. It's hard to say. It's actually a rematch. We had a match at ADCC last year, and it's a little bit controversial in a sense that he was denied 2 points he probably should have gotten. So in that he was denied those points, ended up shooting a double leg takedown to try and secure 2 points to get the points victory, and I was able to get him with a guillotine finish at basically out of bounds on I think it was less than 30 seconds to go. ADCC's overtime period is a wrestling overtime period. And Mason is great at submissions, but he comes from a wrestling background, so he would have a really high wrestling edge there. Whereas in terms of Submission Underground, EBI overtime, I believe that was although he did look very good in the overtime positions, I have a lot more experience there. I believe this was his first ever tournament with overtime.
Okay.
So given that I do have the advantage there, I'm not sure what his strategy will be, whether it is to try and finish me within the 5 minute regulation or to force an overtime.
And I'm glad you brought up that you guys had faced it before. I was watching it earlier, and this whole thing is even more fascinating for maybe people that didn't get to watch Submission Underground 15. You pushed for him to be in the tournament, even though he's only a brown belt, and he completely delivered and is getting the spot with you. Especially since you guys have already, gotten a tangle, felt each other. You have, what makes him a serious test for you? For the people that aren't going to believe it. They go, Mason Fowler, I don't really know that guy. He's not going to be Craig Jones. Almost sell the fans on why Mason Fowler is a threat, and do you think, like, based on what you're telling me, do you feel like the ADCC rules probably benefit more than the Submission Underground using the EBI? Does he not have advantages by being in the cage? Is he really stepping into your house and it's like the Thunderdome?
Yeah, well, it's a tricky one, right? Because although he is good at those positions in overtime, right? So like if we were having a regular roll and he did land the armbar position or he did take my back, he does know how to finish from there, and he does finish guys regularly in tournaments. But starting in those overtime positions is very different. You start in a static position and you have to go from there. So although anyone's got a chance to beat someone in overtime, I basically, for the entire time I've been preparing for these Submission Undergrounds during quarantine, I've been training those positions consistently and training them with probably the team that is the best in those positions. I believe if you looked at the history of the Eddie Bravo tournament, Danaher's guys overwhelmingly won, and they always won in overtime. So I think, Mason looked excellent in those positions. He looked excellent in the tournament, and he does have a chance. So I feel like it is still going to be a compelling matchup. What makes it most compelling, though, is the rematch story. basically a lot of people feel he was robbed of his victory initially, and he's been training very, very hard, and he did look very good in the tournament, and he's earned his revenge spot. And I definitely wanted him in the tournament because, like, I'm not a sort of person that's going to be like, I want to win by any means necessary. I want to win decisively and with a submission, and there should be no questions about that victory. So this gives me another chance to get another victory over him, but probably in a less controversial way.
Let's say you get past Mason, finding the next challenge in Submission Underground gets tougher and tougher, I'm sure, for Chael. It seems like in recent years there's been one man that has been somewhat of Craig Jones' kryptonite, and that's Matheus Diniz. He got by you twice in 2019. Is that a guy you would like to get your hands on in the Submission Underground cage?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm dying to have a rematch with Matheus Diniz. The problem is he would never take a match under that rule set. So Matheus is cut and dry, basically. He has done an EBI tournament in the past, but that was before he was such an established name. Obviously, before he was an ADCC champion. Yeah. Matheus, whether you like it or not, is a points grappler. He does have submissions, but for the most part, he wins positionally with points. And for him, like I remember we had a match at Third Coast Grappling. Third Coast Grappling had a specific rule set where if it went to overtime, you could potentially start in a bad position. And he showed up for the event, and on the day basically refused to do any rule set, which he would potentially start in a disadvantageous position. So we had to change the rules and turn it into a wrestling overtime. So, and I mean, no, I don't take anything away from him for that. Right. That's his specialty. So if he doesn't want to jump out of that, that's for sure his decision. But I mean, he would have to understand that there's definitely more money to be made in the submission only format than there is in those sort of rule sets.
Okay, so he's pretty much ducking you. So we'll move on from Matheus at this point. Are there any dream opponents in MMA? Because like you said, the MMA fighters going into this only helps the brand, helps that particular sport. And there's just a ridiculous amount of MMA guys that still are amazing that really haven't taken that chance. But are there any dream opponents for you that you'd love to get in the cage or Submission Underground? Maybe Ryan Hall, Charles Oliveira, naming Gracie. But you probably, naming and say Gary Tony, you're probably friends with, considering that they're the Henzo and Danaher guys, but a Demian Maia, or maybe even someone in a perfect scenario, a Habib Nurmagomedov. Are there certain guys you'd really love, you hope and Chael can convince to get in that Submission Underground cage soon?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, any of those guys, any guy that's willing to step into that rule set, I definitely feel like I would love those big name matches. Someone I tried to get a match with previous was Fabricio Werdum. We tried to set that up in Texas, but then he actually, I believe his suspension got lifted and he jumped back into the UFC. So I think he lost his comeback and now he's facing Gustafsson. So depending how the Gustafsson fight goes, maybe we can twist his arm and get him in there. Because he's amazing grappler, amazing history in the sport and stuff. That'd be an exciting one.
I actually had on the video podcast I do Back Talk, I had James Krause this week, and I brought up Submission Underground working for them, and he said that Chael offered the opportunity to go against you, and he was just like, no, I'm not doing that. I want none of that. And he even said that he just doesn't think any MMA guy will be able to beat you just because they're spreading themselves too thin on working on other things. And I remember talking to Alexei Olenek that he faced Gordon Ryan, I think it was at Quintet, and he felt he lost to him because he wasn't doing grappling only specific training. Do you agree with James on a certain level? Unless you're coming in and you're doing weeks and months of straight grappling training, you're already coming in with a disadvantage possibly, especially against you?
Yeah, I mean, purely on paper, they are spreading themselves thin, right? So they have to develop a whole range of skills that we don't. And also, the most important part is their grappling isn't submission focused. I would say it's basically more folk style wrestling. It's basically more pins and trying to stand up from bottom, right? So even although they do a lot of jiu-jitsu, their focus for grappling is more folk style. It's more like heisting and getting back to their feet and the ability to pin opponents. Those are the most important skills. But that being said, obviously due to the money in MMA, they have the superior athletes. I mean, apart from my teammate Nicky Rod, we don't really have an amazing athlete in jiu-jitsu, and that's usually they probably get picked up by other sports. So given the MMA fighters are so much more athletic than us, that could potentially be the equalizer with the technical gap. And I think Austin Vanderford kind of showed that in his match against Boogie, because honestly, I would have bet the house on Boogie Man. It's not only is he I guess, technically a superior grappler, his team invented the rule set they competed in, the Eddie Bravo Invitational rules.
Yeah, right.
And Boogie is very strong from those overtime positions. And Austin, due to his athleticism, was able to, obviously still due to his technique. Like I'd seen him, he almost beat Jake Shields in his match in submission underground. And he used the same arm triangle setup he almost tapped Jake with to get Boogie. So technically that's his move. Probably not as technically proficient in a wide range of areas, but I mean, if you're good at that, it still works.